Yes, and I submitted yesterday, and I sent it like 4 different times for specific reason. I tried zip, and then I tried compressing it, and I was like,
Folks, we'll get started shortly, but in the meantime, I am selling Spirit Bear calendars for the low price of $10 if anyone wants to support our fundraiser. I'm just sitting up right there. I take cash or card, so perhaps that will be of interest to some of you. And I'm Jennifer, by the way. I'm very happy to be here on behalf of the Caring Society. We just had to do a little technology switch, so we're going to be getting started in about 5 minutes. And for those who have come in since my last announcement, I am selling Spirit Bear calendars as part of our fundraiser for $10. So this little interlude gives you an extra few minutes to come see me if you'd like. Success. I don't know how to, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all. So sorry for the late start. We're having some technological challenges. So very good afternoon. I'm Stephanie Wellman. I am the Reconciliation and Policy Coordinator with the Caring Society. I'm going to be speaking to you guys about long-term reform. So thankful for you guys to be here with us, and very excited to share some information with you guys. I'm going to be talking about all the things going on with long-term reform right now. And then I have the amazing Jessica with me. She's going to be providing some updates as well. And Raymond is around, and he's going to be sharing some information as well. So again, really want to thank you guys for being with us. And we have a lot of information to share, and we hope it's helpful. So again, I'm Stephanie Wellman. I'm Manitoba Métis, grew up here in Winnipeg. Great to be back. May have brought this cold weather with me to remind me of Winnipeg weather. But I now reside in unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa, where I work at the Caring Society. So work really closely with Dr. Blackstock on long-term reform, and ready to just dive right in with you guys and share some information about what's been going on. I know there's been a lot going on from Calgary, and then December, and then all the time in between. I'm going to touch on Jordan's Principle a little bit, just because I know it's so top of mind for everyone, and we'll share some information and talk about some next steps. So, I think it's always important to start with some context and some history, and so, when we think about what the key problems are that need to be solved in child and family services, we first got to think about the fact that First Nations children are 17.2 times more likely to be placed in child welfare care, and 72% of all First Nations children in care are off reserve. So off reserve number is really key for thinking about long-term reform. So it's really important to keep that in the back of our minds. And so we know the key problems for child and family services are the drivers of child maltreatment, and stopping Canada's discrimination to ensure substantive equality, stopping provincial discrimination, and ultimately accountability to children and youth. So we know the root cause is colonialism and the lack of substantive equality for First Nations in public services on and off reserve. So effective prevention would target those drivers of children and families coming into contact with child and family services. So poverty, poor housing, substance misuse, domestic violence. And so effective prevention requires a targeted approach, and of course must be culturally based. And also very important is to track the well-being of children and families and communities. So we know that only counting for the number of children in care isn't really telling us much, and it's not telling us how children are doing in a holistic way in their communities with their families. So that's why substantive equality is so important. And substantive equality recognizes that not all people start from the same place, and not all people have the same opportunities or privileges. So this is a great graphic to show the difference between equality and substantive equality. Seeing equality where everyone is treated the same, but they are not at the same starting point. So substantive equality ensures that everyone has the opportunity to succeed by providing some people with extra supports. And of course, it's different from equality because everyone has a different starting point. And then, so substantive equality becomes really important to addressing child and family services. And of course, research shows that this can impact economic well-being, can help reduce social problems, and improve health and education and wellness outcomes.
So the Caring Society came up with a plan on how to address the shortfalls in all public services that First Nations experience. And so we have the Spirit Bearer plan. I'm sure you guys are very aware of it. So, the Spirit Bearer plan, of course, calls on Canada to comply with all the rulings at the tribunal and implement Jordan's principle. But really importantly, it calls on Parliament and the Parliamentary Budget Officer to publicly cost out the shortfalls in all federally funded public services for First Nations children and then come up with solutions to fix it. As well, the Spirit Bearer plan calls on, all government officials to receive mandatory training to identify and address government ideology, policies, and practices that get in the way of implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. So, keeping this in mind, then child welfare, a single child welfare program can't solve everything. And, we know that systemic problems require systemic solutions. So we got to think and remind ourselves that we can't expect everything to be solved with the child welfare program. And, child welfare alone can't solve the multi-generational trauma, can't solve poverty, the housing crisis, and Canada's colonial mindset. So it's really just thinking about needing a multi-pronged approach when we think about the well-being of First Nations children and family. So what is this case all about? So as I'm sure you all know, in 2007, the Caring Society and AFN filed a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal for Canada's discrimination against First Nations children in child and family services and Jordan's principle. And in 2016, that claim was substantiated by the tribunal. So the CHRT case is about stopping Canada's discrimination against First Nations children, youth, and families now and forever, and as well as with Jordan's principle. So the path for this case is can be a few different approaches. So it could be negotiation, it could be litigation, or it could be a combination of the two. So I'm going to get into, the draft final settlement agreement that was ultimately not approved by leadership, but at a high level, the AFN took the path of negotiation. So they negotiated an agreement with the Government of Canada. They brought it to First Nations for approval, and ultimately, of course, didn't receive that approval. But if they had, it would have gone before the tribunal for their approval. So for this case, we've seen a lot of success going the road of a combination of negotiation and litigation. So this means consent orders on things that the government's willing to agree to, and then go to contested hearings on matters they won't agree to. So an example of this was the work that happened at the tribunal with the definition of a First Nations child under Jordan's principle. For Jordan's principle, it's as long as a First Nation recognizes a child as being part of their nation, then they're eligible for Jordan's principle services. And of course, the government didn't agree with that approach. But it took away, the on-reserve, off-reserve only being status eligible. It's about First Nations determining who is eligible for Jordan's principle services as being part of their nations. So, as I mentioned, Canada didn't agree to it. We litigated it, and it went all the way up to the federal court, and it was upheld. So it's a really strong indication of how taking, these different approaches is a great way to resolve this case. So in July, as I'm sure you guys all heard, the government announced a draft FSA had been negotiated with AFN and COO and NAN. And it was advertised as a $47 billion deal over 10 years, pardon me. But under closer scrutiny, it was revealed there was many shortfalls to the draft FSA. So, the things you guys really need to know was that it was a 10-year agreement, but nothing to ensure that non-discrimination ended after that. And although it was a 10-year agreement, it was actually subject to annual approvals every year. So it would have to be approved by Parliament every year, and it would also have to be approved by Indigenous Services departmental processes as well. The FSA was for Child and Family Services only, and then some of the concerns with the draft FSA, and we'll get more into it, but a big concern was that the government didn't discharge its duty to consult with First Nations directly. They relied on the AFN to talk to First Nations about the draft FSA, and in that process, there wasn't a clear way for First Nations to provide amendments and how the parties would actually take those amendments on. We did hear of many First Nations that wrote to AFN with amendments, and those amendments didn't get implemented. There is also no opt-out provision in the draft FSA, which is very concerning, especially for First Nations that, might not be part of the AFN or were not represented by the AFN. A big region is Alberta. They don't have representation at the AFN right now. So it was very concerning that their voices weren't being heard or reflected in the draft FSA. So some of the structural weaknesses in the draft FSA, a big one is it would have gotten rid of the tribunal orders and the oversight of the tribunal. Getting rid of the tribunal orders could mean that it's just there's really no way to keep Canada accountable. It didn't seem like there was anything legally binding and ensuring that that children would be protected. And, First Nations leadership really took issue with it being a 10-year agreement, and it was already in year one. First Nations leadership were very clear that Canada needs to end discrimination now and forever for all generations to come. There's also concerns in the draft FSA about confidential governance processes. It wasn't transparent, and ultimately First Nations themselves wouldn't have had a role in the governance of the FSA. The process that was contemplated in the draft FSA was NAN, COO, AFN in Canada would be on what they call the Reform Implementation Committee, which is really the governance of the settlement agreement. And there is no roles for other First Nations to be a part of that. So leadership was very concerned with that. The draft FSA also came with new terms and conditions. And so we just took a little screen grab of what some of the terms and conditions look like. And again, it looked like, $47.8 billion is a lot, but it's not locked in. And so it had a new funding approach that would split funding among First Nations and agencies. But in order for First Nations to receive this funding, they would have to undergo a risk assessment by Indigenous Services Canada to determine their capacity to administer and manage child and family services, and in alignment with the department's directive on transfer payments. And the really big concern with this is that this approach would split, say, prevention funding. It would have some prevention funding going to First Nations and some going to the agencies. But for the funding that's going to First Nations, there is no capacity dollars attached to it. There is no program dollars. And so essentially, First Nations, in order to be able to deliver prevention services, they would have to take money from their kids that's intended for those programs and services so that they could develop, whatever they need to develop their capacity to provide programs and services. So it was a big concern and a big shortfall to how the draft FSA was being proposed. Of course, First Nations should receive prevention funding. They should receive that funding, but it should be, for us, we think a yes and approach. There should be both agencies and First Nations that have prevention funding that can support children and families and the whole community. But it's so important that First Nations have that capacity dollar to be able to actually deliver the services and not have to take money from their kids to be able to do so. So at the request of the Caring Society, the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy undertook an analysis of the gaps in the agency budgets and showed what it would look like with the proposed draft FSA. So what they did is they looked at what the agency budgets and what the agency budgets would be in the draft FSA compared to the model budgets that IFSD developed. And I'll get more into that, but IFSD has undertaken many years of research on what is the cost of reforming child and family services. And so they developed budgets, and it was meant to be a holistic approach. And what ended up coming out of the draft FSA was really a picked apart. Canada liked some components of the draft FSA, but not others, and then they really sliced and diced it. But anyways, what this shows you is the changes in agency budgets if the draft FSA had been approved. And so I think in total it's like almost $10 billion a difference in what would essentially be a loss for agency budgets. So the Caring Society, as soon as the draft FSA was released, we worked with technicians and experts across the country to develop evidence-informed amendments to the draft FSA. We did share our amendments on multiple occasions with the parties. However, there is, like I mentioned, really no clear process for amendments. And then, so just on the screen, some of the key things that high level that Caring Society is proposing for amendments. And then this ultimately came through in resolutions that came in Calgary and then again and subsequently in December at the Special Chiefs Assembly. So restoring First Nations as decision makers. Again, First Nations leadership should be part of the governance process. Hold Canada accountable for its discrimination. Largely, this component was missing from the draft FSA, which was very concerning. As well, to eliminate secrecy in decision making, opening up the governance to be open and transparent. Also proposed a national master agreement and then account for regional variations by doing regional agreements. We also proposed that the tribunal's jurisdiction should be retained because, like we're seeing right now, the government's not doing very good with upholding tribunal orders, and we don't think they're quite ready yet for Canada to be out of the jurisdiction of the tribunal. So we think that we still need the tribunal's jurisdiction and protection. And as well, binding and effective alternative dispute resolution. So again, if there are disputes, it needs to be, whatever the outcome is, it needs to be binding and effective. So I mentioned evidence and research. So this is just a snapshot of some of the key research undertaken to support long-term reform and Jordan's principle. All of this has been ordered by the tribunal on consent, and we have relied very, very heavily on this research and evidence. And so the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, so they're out of University of Ottawa, and their president is a former parliamentary budget officer, so a great person to do financial analysis. So the IFSD, they did 3 phases of work and looking at what is the true cost of delivering child and family services in First Nations. And then also looking at developing what they called measuring to thrive. So it's a performance measurement, and it looks at a holistic approach for gathering data and program data to understand how children, families, and communities are doing. Again, because we know that just counting the number of children in care isn't telling us anything. And then phase 3 was to actually model and test the approach to make sure that it's making sense. And then there's also work underway for First Nations not affiliated to a child welfare agency. So they're receiving their services sometimes from the province or maybe another another agency. Pardon me, and there's been a lot of challenges for First Nations without agencies because their capacity is very different. Their starting point is very, very different, and so some of them need extra funding to get themselves started. So that's been really important work. And then also in 2022 CHRT 8, the government did make orders for data to be done on Jordan's Principle. So IFSD has been looking at the available data on Jordan's Principle and is looking at what's going on with the government's data holdings for Jordan's Principle and looking at if Jordan's Principle is actually implementing substantive equality. So in October, First Nations in Assembly passed quite a few resolutions when they did not support the draft FSA, but they did provide some direction to reset the negotiation process and the negotiation content. So the big one being that there's the establishment of a National Children's Chiefs Commission and calling for it to include representation of all regions, including regions that are not necessarily represented by the AFN. First Nations leadership also overwhelmingly called for off-reserve First Nations kids to be included in the agreement. And they called for a negotiation process that has involvement of all regions and doing away with closed-door secretive negotiations. They also called for a new negotiation team, a new legal counsel, and importantly, to ensure there's free, prior, and informed consent as part of any final settlement agreement process. You know, so the way that the previous FSA was drafted, it was with legal counsel. There wasn't technicians involved. There wasn't regional involvement. So First Nations leadership called for a completely different process. So they also, as I mentioned, called for the creation of a National Children's Chiefs Commission. And their mandate is to work openly and transparently to provide strategic direction and oversight for long-term reform. And they are also mandated to ensure that governance upholds the sacredness of children, youth, and families and is accountable to First Nations. So for Manitoba, the Children's Chiefs Commission representative is Chief Monius. And they're getting underway, getting started. In December, they had their terms of reference kind of approved in principle, and they're very eager to get started. So I mentioned this earlier. So this is the Jordan's Principle definition of First Nations child. And as I mentioned, it's about if a First Nation recognizes a child as being part of their nation, then they're eligible for Jordan's Principle. So the Caring Society is proposing to apply this definition of First Nations child for the Child and Family Services Program. And the newer developments that just happened about 10 days ago. So on January 7th, Canada, Chiefs of Ontario, and Anishinaabe Nation, they announced that they intend to reach a long-term reform settlement agreement that's Ontario-specific. And so, you know, we're very concerned with this because Canada is required by the tribunal legal orders to end discrimination for all First Nations children. And Canada's decision to only negotiate with First Nation organizations that agreed with its flawed draft FSA is really contrary to good faith negotiations and honor of the Crown. And we think it's retaliatory as well. So in response to this, Canada's refusal to negotiate a national path, the Caring Society has filed a motion with the tribunal seeking orders to compel Canada to return to the negotiation table. So we just did this just a few days ago, and it was really important to us that we stand tall on this and not let Canada's colonial divide and conquer approach stand. And Canada cannot choose which of its child victims get justice, because all children matter, every child matters, and we have to make sure that we end discrimination for them as well. Oh, back on, there we go. So we also did a Jordan's Principle non-compliance motion. So we actually filed this back in December of 2023, and it was because of we were really concerned with Canada's failure to adhere to tribunal orders on Jordan's Principle. So we were hearing lots of concerns about their failure to adhere to reasonable timeframes, to fund and reimburse approved requests, and we were hearing a lot of challenges that were going on out there for Jordan's Principle. So we filed that in December, and there was some delays, but in September we did have the hearing, and then just recently on November 21st, the tribunal did issue a summary ruling, and the tribunal did order Canada to immediately tackle and eliminate the backlog and to report on their progress as soon as December 10th. So the tribunal also ordered the parties to co-develop measures and mechanisms to address urgent requests. That's been a big challenge. Reimbursement delays, coordination among federal programs. I thought that was really interesting as well. The tribunal called on Canada to say it's not enough to just approve a request. You also got to support families in navigating all the different federal programs. You can't just leave them out there on their own. There was also orders around or calling on the parties to work together on referrals, the 24-hour call center, and as well as a national and independent complaints mechanism. So Canada did report on December 10th with the tribunal, and they reported that there's approximately 140,000 backlog requests and about 25,000 family and community identified urgent requests. So, but Canada said they didn't really have a plan of how they're going to address this backlog. Also on December 20th, right before Christmas, Canada filed for a judicial review of these orders. And they also asked for the motion to be put in abeyance, which means just on pause, because the tribunal hasn't yet provided their full written reasons. So the government wanted the opportunity to have those full reasons before moving forward with their appeal. And obviously, the Caring Society is really disappointed with this, and we can't delay the full and proper implementation of Jordan's Principle because it does cause serious risks to children and families, and of course contradicts the direction provided by First Nations. So there's also the 20th anniversary of Jordan's Principle coming up this year, May 10th, 2025. So just some ideas of things you guys can do. So, teddy bear parades, tea parties, screening Spirit Bear and Children Make History, and Jordan River Anderson, the Messenger. Really excited to see what you guys are going to do on May 10th. And then my last slide is just what you can do. Really encourage you guys to check out the Caring Society website. We always have a lot of information on our website. We post pretty much everything. So encourage you guys to learn more, and wherever you can to support the regional technicians, regional groups that you guys have going on, to ultimately support First Nations leadership. I will say, we have the Children's Chiefs Commission, as well as the informal technical working group. So this is a committee that the Caring Society has been coordinating on a volunteer basis, and there's a lot of Manitoba representation, so you guys are really well represented there, and some really strong voices at that committee, and anyone's welcome to reach out and chat about it. It's a very, very open circle, and the intent is to really come together, share information, and hear what's going on out there so we can support each other. And also encourage you guys to provide input to anything we share, any of our positions. Cindy's very adamant that, you know, if you guys have better ideas, we love to hear them. So, you know, on our website, we have things like proposed amendments, all these things. So, you know, we really welcome your feedback and ideas. And also encourage you guys to watch out for updates on the Jordan's principal non-compliance motion, and you know, wherever possible to continue to call on Canada and leadership to support and implement the tribunal's orders and make sure that they are working well with First Nations. So my last slide is just contact information, and we would love to hear from you guys anytime. So I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, and she's going to provide some Manitoba-specific content.
Okay. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for braving the storm, the blizzard, and the alerts from our phone, sending us into shoots of anxiety, as we're driving. I was driving and I got that alert and it was like, oh my gosh. So thank you all for being here. I know it's busy times. It's actually like critical times. My goodness. You heard from Stephanie all the work that's being done. We often are off doing our things, but there's some really big things happening in child welfare. And as you know, so the on-the-ground experience, of course, that we're doing in the tribunal and in soon to be probably the federal court with some of the issues being disputed by Canada. There's a lot going on, and so we really appreciate these opportunities to come together, sit together, think, right? We have hearts that are pumping full of blood, and when we do our work, sometimes we have to come together and really have these opportunities to become informed and to have good and important discussions together. So I want to acknowledge our hosts. I want to acknowledge the territory that we're on, Treaty 1 territory. Thank you to Norway House Cree Nation and Kiniseo CP Minnesota Agency for hosting. Thank you to the Caring Society and of course, the presence is missed. Mary T.G. was supposed to also be presenting. She's, of course, one of our board of directors, and we have our other team members. We have, of course, Raymond Shingus, who's our fearless president of the board. Thank you, Raymond. Drove all the way from Yorkton, 4 hours in part of a blizzard. And Ken Richard, who, again, another warrior board member, came all the way from Newfoundland, leading an inquiry for the Innu Nations out in the East Coast. So all of us are always busy doing our thing in child welfare. And again, we need everybody on this. So thank you all for being here. So my name is Jessica Saunders. I'm from Cranberry Portage, and I'm a member of Opaskwayak Cree Nation. I'm a lawyer by trade, and I've practiced child and family services, I guess, law or child and family well-being law pretty much my whole career. So this is not something that I kind of came to. This was something that I was very much pulled into, and all throughout my career I've done nothing almost exclusively but this area of law and Indigenous law. I'm also a board of director of the Caring Society. So I'll just, I was asked to provide a Manitoba perspective. So I've got a few things that I want to go over with you. But of course, as a lawyer, I just want to say this information is for sharing purposes. It's not intended to be legal advice. It's, of course, with the hope that, you know, we inform and we get again, the blood flowing and pumping on these issues. But they're my insights. So certainly if you want legal advice on it, you know, consult your lawyers or come have another chat with me outside of this. Now, oh my goodness, I could take up this whole time and we could just talk. But I wanted to focus the discussion on, first I'm going to ground myself, and I find that always helps. Next, I want to chat about some of the things that are going on in long-term reform that are really concerning. The one that I see just glaringly the minute I picked up that FSA the first time on July 11th, it was actually my birthday that thing came out, and you'll see the version I have of it, you know, is just scribbled all over the place, and there's stains on it because I've taken it everywhere on many different flights. It's traveled with me everywhere, and I've spent a lot of time within that draft agreement. And so when I first picked it up and I started seeing some of the issues, there's a huge agency-nation divide. And when Stephanie, you know, spoke of divide and conquer, we're seeing it play out. The words were there, and now, as we anticipated, we're seeing that play out in some of the press releases and some of the discussion coming out across the nation from key players on this about these issues. I also want to address how it's soft on Canada's discrimination, like so soft. This whole thing is about ending discrimination, and the whole thing, that whole agreement is entirely soft and falls abysmally short of addressing what we need to do for First Nations children and families. The issue of substantive equality that we see through certain things, the way certain nations and other nations' children are going to fare better under this agreement than our nation, our children here in Manitoba. I have the concrete examples that we see. I don't have a lot of time, but I focused on 2 examples where we're supposed to be fighting for substantive equality for all First Nations children, so all First Nations kids are treated like all other Canadian kids. That's what this whole case was about. But what we're seeing in the way it was drafted with certain lawyers sitting in the room in certain positions is the agreement that came out favors Ontario's children, and it leaves Manitoba and the rest of us in a really awkward position. How can we agree to an agreement that's going to favor some children and families over others? So we have the numbers, we have the sections. It's not just we're talking, you know, things of, you know, just, you know, general stuff. We've got the actual provisions to show you so that when you're hearing things in the news about people talking, you can actually know the provisions and you can line up the provisions with what it is people are saying. And we'll get to that, because one thing I caution is that if you're hearing people speak in favor of this agreement, it's likely because they're Canada, because this agreement favors Canada big time, or they're from Ontario, because this agreement very much favors Ontario, or they didn't read it. And I don't mean to be disrespectful. Other lawyers have said that, but we're going to spend some time this afternoon going through some of those things so that you can see for yourselves and then evaluate what it is people are saying. Because what we want is accountability, transparency, inclusivity for everybody in this process and for everybody to be informed, because it's not only the leaders who are at the table doing this, the on-the-ground people who are having to deal with the issues of the children, of the families on a day-to-day basis. We have to connect everybody on these issues. And then we don't just talk about the issues, we also bring proposed solutions. And the Caring Society, our team that's been assisting, so it's been Cindy Blackstock, Mary Teege, and myself as the board that's been, and Ray, the rest of the board, we're all involved in this, don't get me wrong, but we've been working as a team to make sure that long-term reform negotiation is happening a certain way. And we can say there were just clear reasons why the Caring Society had to leave the negotiations. And we see it when you now see the agreement that came forward, and that was voted down in October by nations. So just putting it quite simply, this whole case, and now the task we have is to eliminate discrimination and prevent it from happening again. Now, to ground ourselves, these are the words from the tribunal. We have to make sure that we're ending systemic discrimination. So these are the words of the tribunal after hearing mounds of evidence from First Nations. Complete justice will be achieved when systemic discrimination no longer exists. Now, their words, the tribunal, again, very skilled arbiters that have been looking at this issue for years, since 2007. And of course, this is a whole regime that's been set up under human rights legislation to look at discrimination in all areas: labor, employment, gender discrimination, right? So when they came to now First Nations discrimination against First Nation kids, they've said, these are harms of the worst kind. The magnitude of harms that were inflicted upon First Nations children, families, communities, and nations, Canada ought to bear this in mind as an important reminder to never repeat history. And they say the cycle of harm must be broken. So this, as the Human Rights Act has been in place for some time and this whole regime to support it, this particular case was the largest settlement of its kind in Canadian history. So, and we don't need a crystal ball, to see what this FSA on, long-term reform was going to be like. We looked to what happened when they did the FSA on compensation. So that's, the compensation to the actual families and children that were discriminated against with the way Canada operated Child and Family Services. When they went to do that FSA, there was a whole bunch of things, issues with free, prior, and informed consent, a lot of different things that they said. And so now when this final settlement agreement to wrap things up on compensation came to the tribunal saying these words, right? So many important words. I tried to highlight some. It's on, the elimination of the systemic racial discrimination found and the need to prevent it from happening. A complete reform. First Nations, children, and communities have to have the rights, opportunities, and privileges they've been denied. We need a transformation that will protect generations to come. So, and those sections are there. Now, just to summarize, when we look at some of their words, the cycle of harm must be broken. A complete reform. A transformation that will protect generations to come. And again, this was after hearing mounds and mounds, over 40,000 pages of documents in the tribunal. Many of those witnesses were from Manitoba as well, right? But those are the requirements. That's some of the wording that they came out in their most recent decision on the long-term reform, the final settlement agreement on compensation. So those are the tribunal's words, and we have to heed them, because now when you have the long-term reform, final settlement agreement, we see that it falls short. It doesn't break the cycle of harm. It actually perpetuates it. It's not a complete reform. It's actually more of the same. And it doesn't protect generations to come, in that it's time limited and it's only a 10-year agreement. That's not what was intended. So these words are so important. And let's not forget that this whole thing was, the discrimination came as a result of underfunding the First Nations CFS program and the way that it was designed, managed, and controlled for First Nations on reserve. So when I looked at the FSA, I was asking myself, how is this any different? How, when the tribunal tells us complete reform, protect generations to come, when I read the agreement, the draft, it was actually, how this is more of the same. So huge issues we have. On the next one, I think this is really important, because when they did the FSA and they came to Manitoba in August, when a lot of people were having, summer celebrations and things, there was a room and there was very few people. I think, we did a head count of how many, leaders were represented at the table, and there was not a lot. But the AFN's lawyer, Stewart, came and told the Manitoba, leadership and technicians that this is about a program, So Overd McCurdy was there, and he was speaking about how this is, all of it is interrelated, and there's issues of self-determination within this. It's about, making sure that everyone has, the opportunity to review this. And when we talk self-determination, principles like free, prior, and informed consent, that you don't provide us with, an agreement before we're being asked to vote on it in in October, and come and talk to us as though it's a done deal. Right? Chiefs at that presentation spoke about it. And in response to that, the lawyer said, well, it's not about self-determination. It's not about all that stuff. It's about reforming a program, was what he said to the crowd, was what he said in response to those comments put forward very eloquently by people like Ovid McCurdy, who have, done this his whole life and have advocated for these things, and was a technician actually reviewing some child welfare, papers in the early days, right? So what I want to remind is that this is not merely about reforming a program, it's about ending discrimination. So anytime anybody tells you that this is, it's a program, it's about the CFS program. No, the whole thing was this set precedent, groundbreaking precedent to Canada about ending discrimination against First Nation children and families. Another thing I do, because I'm a little bit much, I kind of... I go a little overboard sometimes, but I truly, when it comes to grounding myself in things, this is a painting by Kent Monkman, who's Indigenous Anishinaabe from Manitoba. He's the guy who did that large painting, The Scream. And, you see the RCMP, the Mounties, and the church that are taking the kids, right? Oh, that's a painting that just gets me. And I took my kids to this exhibit when it came to Manitoba because it was, to me, historical. And this is a painting that he has called The Subjugation of Truth. And he did it back in 2016, just after the TRC final report. So I just want to remind you, too, let's not ever forget who we're dealing with. We're dealing with Canada. And Cindy always says, Indigenous peoples, we have our own way of doing things that we've done for generations, and so does Canada. Canada, let's not forget, the Crown, right? This is a picture, and you have Sir John A. Macdonald, the Mounties, the church, and the parliamentary, Secretary of Indian Affairs, whatever it was called at the time. And you have to the left Poundmaker, and you have, seated directly straight within view, Big Bear. And at that time, in 1882, Big Bear, as we know, attempted at the negotiations of Treaty 6 to try and get nations, if we have to sign treaties because of poverty, because of all these things and the influx of settlers, he said, okay, if the provision is reserved lands, let's get a plot where all of us can have our reserves together because we're stronger together. He tried to unify the nations together around this idea of if treaties coming, let's organize here and get together. What did Canada do? They stopped rations to those nations that were listening to Big Bear, and they put them in jail. And let's not forget that, you had the treaty that said certain things. It had land extinguishment provisions and all of these things. And then it had things like, annuity, $5 per person, right? I can imagine at that time, people were likely saying, wow, $5 per person. Look at the amount. When you actually read the text of the treaty, it has land extinguishment provisions. It has all of these things within there. And as soon as I saw this settlement agreement and I read it, and then, you hear the $47.8 billion number and people that are just fixated on a number, my mind just went to this painting, and it still does, because it's almost like, you have people that are trying to force this agreement and say, it's the $47.8 billion. But look at the actual terms and conditions. Look at what the terms of the agreement say. So the thing that gets me too when I look at this is I see people like, Dr. Cindy Blackstock and Mary Teegee and Ray and Ken, the work that we've been doing to try unite people on the issues. And this is on record in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. So this was back in 2015. There was a cost award made against Canada for surveilling and following Dr. Cindy Blackstock. She was awarded $20,000 in punitive damages, which means the court recognized you have CSIS, Canada's intelligence agency, following a First Nations advocate, but they couldn't put her in jail. They couldn't, actually, I'm sure they will cut off rations at some point, an equivalent to. So they surveilled her and they followed her. And she went to court and she said, okay, I don't have to take that, went to court and got a cost award. So that's on record, that there's a cost award against Canada for surveillance and retaliation against Cindy Blackstock. Another aspect to this that I just always kind of, keep in mind is we're not stuck at that table powerless with shackles and, we're not stuck at that table with Canada. We now have the tribunal and the courts, And there are now people, decision makers, who are sitting in that chair that are more reflective of the kind of justice and the kind of realities we face. So when those earlier decisions of the tribunal on the merit that said in 2016, Canada, you discriminated, and then go to the negotiation table and negotiate, when Canada didn't negotiate, in 2019, the tribunal said, okay, I'm going to award compensation. We're going to award compensation to the highest degree under human rights legislation. Then it gets to the desk of a federal court judge in 2021, and he makes a decision. That judge was Justice Paul Favel, a First Nation man from Poundmaker Cree Nation. He went through he did this masterful decision that went through all the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decisions that were all based on evidence that were put forward by people like Ray, Cindy Blackstock, Elsie Flett, Ken Richard, First Nations from across Canada, all that evidence in the tribunal, and then comes to Justice Paul Favel's desk, and he upholds it. That was a magic moment, because in 2021, when he made that decision upholding all the prior decisions of the tribunal, Canada had to follow it. That's when Canada then comes to the table, and that's when we start hearing the numbers of the 40 billion, the largest settlement in Canadian history in 2021, because they had to come to the table and take it serious. But so the good thing is we're not stuck at that table. We're not stuck with their version, and we need to, so going to the tribunal and on to the federal court. That's the good news. Now on the Manitoba experience, as I said, we can go on and on and on. But I also want to, the last, piece was about never forget who we're dealing with, which is Canada. They have their own way of doing things, and we've had to work through litigation, negotiation, grassroots political advocacy to change that, right? But the Manitoba experience, let's not forget who we are. We look at all of the things that we've done in this jurisdiction. Look at the advocacy we've done. Wabung, Our Tomorrows, 1971. That was First Nations, the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood as it was, now the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, that stood out against the white paper and said, we have our own approach to these things. And of course there was approach for child and family well-being within there. The Manitoba Indian Child Welfare Subcommittee report to 1980. So it wasn't just, okay, we're gonna write a book and talk about it. It's, we're going to get together some more ideas, we're going to get a whole subcommittee, we're going to organize, and here we go. We're also the jurisdiction of the Kimmelman inquiry, the Kimmelman report in 1985. Other jurisdictions were grappling with the issue, but Manitoba, because of the strong political advocacy of First Nations, said we cannot adopt our kids out anymore. The 60 scoop, so No Quiet Place, was the review into First Nation and Métis adoptions and placements, and the Kimmelman inquiry report was released in 1985, the year I was born, and it was all on, the 60 scoop and the fact that Canada, policy, no workers were just going, okay, best interest of the child, adopt out. Best interest of the child, adopt out. The First Nations said, hey, you're taking all of our kids. You're applying this discriminatory practice disproportionately against our kids. So stop it, and advocacy, and change a report, right? So then again, it goes on and on and on. The report of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. And of course, Murray Sinclair, as he then was a young judge. That was one of the first things that he took on when he first became appointed. Looking at the criminal justice system, Chapter 14 on child welfare, that led to the system we now operate on. All of these things, like there's so many different things in Manitoba. So we have a unique history, and yes, it's led us into some places. Chief Heidi Cook says that Manitoba is also ground zero for apprehensions of Indigenous kids in Canada, and that's true. But we're also effective advocates, as we've shown. Ovid McCurdy, right? AFN, he led on a sovereignty-based approach. That AFN wasn't just, a diplomacy office. That, we're doing more than programs. We have to do sovereignty. Phil Fontaine with the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Murray Sinclair with, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry and the TRC report. First calls to action on child welfare, right? Manitoba. It's for the whole of everybody, but Manitoba, we have these unique perspectives and experiences. We've lived it, we've wrote about it, and we've tried in our way to do something about it, especially in child welfare. And this all happened, I want to remind too, is because it was leaders and it was technicians in the same canoe working all of our efforts aimed at the results for children and families. What it's been along the times is actually laws and colonial policies and tactics like divide and conquer that has led to this current agency-nation divide. So there's been a lot of unnecessary politics on this, and we've heard some of the comments coming out from, the national chief, and I've read some comments online, but I just want to say, and I've said this before, right? Anyone who supported this agreement, you have to really look at what it says. And I struggle because I had a whole bunch of things that I was going to talk about on that, but this isn't, the agencies won is what National Chief said after, nations and leaders at the AFN in October voted down this agreement. She said, oh, the agencies won. The crazy thing is people weren't even given a fair chance to hear all the information. At AFN in October, we had to fight for it. They had a whole agenda that was just based on hearing from AFN, COO, and NAN, the parties who negotiated this, to have free, prior, and informed consent, which is a requirement of international law that Canada has made part of our law from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You have to meet those requirements free. Informed. You have to be informed. So, no offense, but what they were kind of doing was like, that quote about fascism, Bertrand Russell, right? First they fascinate the fools, and then they muzzle the intelligent. And that's what was happening at AFN in October, where it was like, okay, pull out all these numbers, do all these presentations, and don't let the Caring Society or anybody else speak. And that didn't work, thankfully. We were able to be put on the agenda, and members of our team, Ray, Cindy, Mary, myself, Andre Bear, we all were able to speak to some of these issues and offer that ability to become informed on all of the issues, not just those that were kind of being, force-fed through certain people who were at the table and didn't provide a whole view perspective of it in order to weigh your options and make an informed decision. So when that was done in October, the nations then voted, the chiefs voted, and they voted the agreement down. And after that, we hear the national chief then saying, oh, the agencies won. And, and to me, it's like, oh my goodness, even as a lawyer, right? It's like when I lose or I don't get the result that I want, I don't pout and blame everybody else, right? It's a matter of what did I do? What do I need to do to make this better? In order to get that result, what could I have done better to bring up the issue, right? So I will tell you what I've been trying to guide friends of mine who are even like, these are people that, you respect and you want to work with, you have to work with, right? But it's hard when they're taking these positions. So one thing I tell people who are struggling on the issue of, okay, what the national chief's saying, what everybody else is saying is just, if you focus on the issue, you'll see it. Focus on the issue, just the issue. And the politics and all the other things, if you just focus on the issues. So that's why our discussion today is going to focus on, okay, well, we're doing it right now, we're getting into it, but the issues and the law, right? That's the main thing. So the draft FSA, as I said, soft on Canada's discrimination. We need equitable, fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory provisions to protect children, families, and nations. It doesn't go far enough, and it creates this huge divide between agencies and nations. So if we move to the next slide, the way they did this too is they frame it as agencies needing to be accountable to First Nations. And we know that because in Manitoba, we've had this history of governance, and in 2000, in the year 2003, there was huge changes to make sure that nations were governing agencies and the establishment of the authorities. And now most of our boards are reflective of community and local governance, right? So in Manitoba, we have a different experience. And so when this FSA came out, and you read in the preamble, and it has all this stuff about the focus being on First Nation agencies being accountable First Nations, it's distracting from the issue of Canada being accountable to First Nations, all of us. So it does that in so many ways, and they're very clear in the preamble, and we'll go through that. But then it also does things, as Stephanie alluded to, and we'll go through some of those examples, where it's like, okay, nations are going to be funded this, agencies are going to be funded this. And it was negotiated by people who don't understand us, that the coming together of nations and technicians to do certain things and in a certain way, right? That no, just divide, conquer, and leave this side without capacity, but taking on all the liability on the nation side. Leave the agencies over here with all the responsibility, but without any funding to do what they need to do. So it really creates more problems, but who suffers? Children and families who fall through the cracks. So, and that's who we ultimately have to measure this agreement by, is by children and families. So when you look at the preamble, it's completely written by Canada. Not what you'd expect in a historic settlement that the tribunal called harms of the worst kind to First Nation kids and families. The provision actually says, and whereas the accountability structure built into the First Nation CFS program is intended to ensure First Nation CFS agencies are accountable to the First Nations governments and communities they serve. The accountability structure must ensure Canada is accountable to children, families, and nations to end discrimination and ensure it doesn't reoccur. Now, another provision that they have in there is they say, well, this final settlement agreement, it's a record of the necessary steps and actions, as well as the embodiment of the parties' best efforts to eliminate the discrimination found by the tribunal. They also have wording in there that says, the purpose of the agreement is intended, it's with the intent to end discrimination. That's not what was fought for from 2007 in legal proceedings all the way to the federal court at certain times, right up until that decision in 2019 and in the orders that followed. Best efforts and the intention to end is not what's required. Actually, ending discrimination is what's required under law. That's the legal requirement. And again, in terms of this agency-nation divide in Manitoba, here our experience is different, and it's not perfect. There's a long way to go. But the regime here is different in that First Nations here have had jurisdiction through those early bilateral and tripartite agreements since the 80s for on-reserve, and then 2000, since 2003, off-reserve, where your agencies have offices in Winnipeg and everywhere else, right? That's not the case with the rest of Canada. So the governance relationship is different between nations and agencies here in Manitoba. But the issues that we're going to see, they go across the board to all nations and agencies and will affect those in particular here in Manitoba, where you have agencies who've been quite established and for the most part, are delivering services in accordance with their nation's mandate, but now they're not going to have the funding to do it. Or you have the reverse, where you have nations who are building that up, and then they have all the liability and none of the capacity. So prevention funding, as Stephanie said, is the prime example of that in this agreement, where it's being allocated completely to First Nations at $2,603 per person on reserve, adjusted for inflation and remoteness, and a minimum $75,000 for each First Nation for capacity. So that's laughable, because what can you do with $75,000 for each First Nation on capacity? Nations can choose to transfer that to their agencies. But the crazy thing is, when we talk about prevention, that's full circle. So that's primary prevention, which is workshops, cultural and recreation activities, fishing derbies, all those good community events that get everybody together. Secondary prevention, which is home visiting programs, mentorship programs, reunification supports to support families, reunifying, getting kids back with their families, their grandparents, providing supports for that. And then tertiary, which is crisis intervention, intensive family preservation services. All of that is covered in those funds, right? AFN in its information sessions when it came to Winnipeg in August, and that was the 19th to the 21st, has changed this. So all the prevention funding was going to the nations. with the option to, flow to the agencies. But they've changed that position and they said, okay, well, the agencies will get the tertiary prevention. So that's for the crisis intervention, intensive family preservation, treatment, all that kind of stuff. So they came to Manitoba and said that that would be the case, that agencies are going to get that third level. But then it wasn't in their proposed amendments that they said they were making to the draft FSA. So those are all things we have to carefully watch. And as we know, the calls come in and it's usually, we need these funds, and it's often within the realm of prevention services. The issue with that is the legal obligations, of course, and we've advised our clients on this. So now you have nations that are providing child and family services, prevention services in primary, secondary, tertiary, but they don't have the same level of insurance for liability protection for those services that agencies have had over the course of the years. And in order to get insurance, you have to build up certain things, and we had a whole session on that last year. The legal obligation has also become more pressing because since the passing of the national legislation, C-92, Section 14.1 says that you now have to prioritize prevention services over any other service. So that's a legal requirement. And what we know in Manitoba, as our unique experience too, is we're heavily litigious. There is a guy who goes around filing class actions, filing claims in court, and we see him in court all the time. And he's bringing claims against agencies and everybody, right? And we know there's going to come a day when there's going to be this provision in a legal document that says, hey, agency, or hey, First Nation, you had the obligation to prioritize providing my family prevention over protection services. That's a legal requirement in the federal legislation, C-92. That's in Section 14.1. You had to prioritize those services and you didn't. And now I'm going to sue you. And that could be a class action one day. And we have this agreement that's saying, okay, well, even though the agencies have the legal responsibility for doing it all this time, we're going to take that funding, we're going to plunk it to the nations. Now, the nations are going to have to do that. Now, the nations who haven't been providing those services and have to build up the capacity are going to have to assume full responsibility without having the liability coverage. Right now, they're liable. And that's another thing. Under this FSA, Canada did nothing to even help First Nations on liability issues. That's something AFN should be advocating for, and that's something that they conveniently just say, who cares? 47.8 billion, which it isn't even 47.8 billion, and we'll get to that. But these are key provisions because it's like you're supposed to be protecting nations' interests, not, handshakes with the prime minister or whatever the case may be, right? This isn't that purpose. It's you look at the terms, and this is glaringly, this is what the issue is, right? And of course, it's going to create gaps. So proposed amendments by AFN don't deal with liability, and it's a huge issue when we come to future cases. Another one we see it is on the results funding. So our ability to do anything in funding is going to rely on us being able to show that we've track the funding and what's being done to outcomes for kids and families. Outcomes. How we do that, we get good funding on data and all the different things, right? Data, IT, all the stuff that we need to do to collect, monitor, evaluate. So now we have this results funding that's in the agreement, and it's meant to track all these different things. It's 5% of an agency's annual baseline funding. That was recommended by the experts, the IFSD. And it's for First Nation agencies to track outcomes to demonstrate the impacts that those efforts are having on the well-being of children and families. So that's at 5%. But that funding is now under this agreement, and this is the troubling thing, it's allocated to First Nations. And that's fine because First Nations need to do this too. But First Nations don't have, the computing, capacity. They don't have a lot of the IT and the work is being done by the agency over here. But the nations get the dollars to track it. So it's another thing where it's like, okay, that it's a responsibility of the agencies, but the agencies don't have funding to do it. So how are we going to get the actual important stuff that we need? Doesn't matter if agency nation. The issue is that in order to show we're making a difference for children and families, we have to show the dollars that we're getting are connect and the income. We need to track, okay, when you send that child to treatment, yes, it's $30,000, but those intensive mental health supports and then the aftercare and all of this, then you track that child over time. And then you track all the people, you know, when that child is able to, you know, go to this youth program and inspire other youth, or, you know, because that child did it, then, okay, their siblings are doing much better, you know, tracking all of that. How do we track those well-being, you know, outcomes? So all of these things like knowledge of Indigenous languages, connection, access to land, community-based activities, spirituality, stability, the moves in care, the incidence of abuse of children in care, the reason why kids are entering care, housing factors, the reason why kids are leaving care, exit and pre and postnatal services, medical services, mental health services, all of these things that are now a requirement to track for agencies, they're required when we need them to show those outcomes, right? But then the funding, it's like, okay, the funding's over here, but the things are like, it's creating confusion and it makes no sense. It absolutely makes no sense. And to me, when people are saying, oh, you guys got to agree to this agreement because Pierre Poilievre is going to come in, right? To me, I say, these things are what's going to help us. So it doesn't matter if it's Justin Trudeau, Krista Freeland, Pierre Poilievre, First Nations' ability to do anything is going to be found in the gravy, which is how well do you take those dollars and all the things you do and deliver on those outcomes. That's what's going to be key. And so this results funding is so important for that. We know there's going to be shortfalls. As Stephanie said, IFSD has projected a shortfall for the Manitoba region alone of $2.379 billion over 5 years. That's just in Manitoba. So the funding you're currently getting now, right, there's going to be a $2.379 billion shortfall over 5 years just in Manitoba. The crazy thing for the Manitoba experience that we all need to know is that Manitoba is the region being most shortchanged by this proposed agreement. And those are experts who looked at all of the things. When we look at Canada's stuff, it's just a picture with here's how 47.8 billion and here's how much each region. There's nothing based on there. Whereas the expert reports are like, okay, they didn't give us any numbers, but based on the projections, here's the baseline from this year, and the experts have what they have. And based on the data, at least there's some data, they were able to project, and it is actually a shortfall. So what do you do when there's a shortfall? My goodness, this agreement has nations and agencies jumping through this massive gauntlet. And I want people to bear mind to this because they're going to take this and probably apply this to Jordan's principle and try and do it over there. And I don't have time to go through everything, but this is just to show you, right? We know there's going to be shortfalls and in the billions for Manitoba, and that we're going to be the most shortchanged. So what happens when we need to then go and try and get more funds under this agreement? It's a service provider funding adjustment request, and all the sections are there. First Nations can bring it, and so can agencies. You can only bring it, though, for reasons beyond its reasonable control. That's in there. And Canada, those are a whole bunch of legal words that just protect Canada. Reasons beyond its reasonable control. Now, when a First Nation wants to bring, you know, we don't have enough prevention dollars to send, you know, our children or families to treatment, it's now an unforeseen event beyond its reasonable control, not including reasonably foreseeable natural events or circumstances covered by other government programs or policies. So when you have a First Nation that has to meet that standard, they have to read that, okay, that's a whole bunch of stuff that just covers Canada to say, you know what, we're not going to hear from you because was that an unforeseen event? Was that beyond your control? Is it including reasonably foreseeable natural events or circumstances covered by other government programs and policies? Like, holy goodness, right out the gate, are you even eligible to make a request? I can't figure that out. What it does is it leaves it so open for Canada to just, you know, use all those terms to its advantage. It is not clear in law. And then if we move on, just on these requests, okay, so let's assume an agency is making them and they have the agreement of the nation to do so. Don't have enough money for prevention. Here's, you know, we got to do this request. Within 30 days, okay, so you do the request, and there's a whole bunch of stuff when you do the request. So there's 15 days within receiving the request, ISCAS to meet with the service provider, with the agency. Now, I don't know about you, but if anyone's doing Jordan's Principle and you see 15 days, does Canada actually follow a 15-day timeline? We're now in the tribunal over all these unanswered requests, so I don't know about this provision, right? I don't know that they're actually going to meet in 15 days. Then it says within 30 days of that meeting, ISK shall make a determination. It's okay, in one breath it says, ISK shall make a determination on that request. Then it says in the next breath, if ISK has not made such a determination within that 30-day period, the request shall be deemed to have been denied, and the agency may access the claimant dispute tribunal. So under their process of, if you don't have enough money, come to us, but, it says in one breath, oh, we have to make a determination. Then in the next breath it says, oh, but if we don't, it's just deemed to be denied. That's what this says. All these lawyers in the room in Ottawa that were, negotiating this, and we weren't at the table. The Caring Society wasn't there, right? Bear that in mind, because there's no way this would have been in there. What the Caring Society actually says is flip that around. They should be deemed approved. That will get Canada to move, and that's what the Caring Society said in our position on long-term reform. When you come to cases where First Nations are putting together the case, here we need more, right? The Caring Society says, if Canada doesn't act, which we know they don't, because in the tribunal we've had to fight them on over 30 non-compliance orders, right? When they don't act, deem it to be approved, is what we say. But in this agreement with AFN, COO, and NAN in Canada, all these skilled lawyers sat in a room and came out with this provision that says, oh, we'll just deem it denied. Then, oh my goodness, even requests on an urgent basis. So if you have, and we saw this in the tribunal and it's terrible, you have mental health services that are life and death, right? We've seen how Canada responds to that in the tribunal timeline. But when we have urgent basis requests, so life and death, right? Even there too. Canada, you have to respond within 5 days, and we know on Jordan's Principle urgent requests, they don't respond. But under here it says, so the request shall be, again, denied. So if Canada doesn't respond to that request, if they haven't made a determination with respect to that request within 10 days on urgent requests, even an urgent request is deemed to have been denied. And you have the provisions in the agreement there. So when you hear, people like, no offense, but lawyers or political leaders who are saying we need to agree to this agreement, you tell them, take them these provisions. What about Section 198? What about Section 199? When I don't have enough prevention dollars as a First Nation or as an agency, when I don't have enough, dollars to support a reunification or support treatment. And treatment, by the way, $30,000 one person for treatment. So if we don't have enough, because this funding model isn't needs-based, so we know there's going to be shortfalls, that's what you're stuck with. And that's what they're pressuring everybody to agree to. So when we say and when we know they're pushing this agreement, we know they haven't read this. At least I think they haven't read it. You would think if they read it, they would, the reaction is like, what? And there's a whole bunch of stuff within this dispute process, right? Like the crazy thing, we'll just move to the next page. So then there's going to be a claimant dispute process, and there's this whole thing you have to jump through. So an agency has to do this big written document, all this stuff that goes into this written thing. Canada doesn't even have to make a decision on that written thing. You have this dispute resolution tribunal. And this gets me because as a lawyer, I have a different understanding of what a dispute resolution tribunal should do. As an Indigenous person, I have a different view of what dispute resolution and mediation looks like, right? When I look at this agreement, it's completely tailored to Canada because again, you have this, masterful notice, all these hoops that an agency or a nation has to jump through that go through their hardship after Canada just deems it denied, then they have to do this other document. Then Canada still doesn't have to do nothing. Rather, they have a president who's appointed by Canada that has to, deliver on a silver platter this claimant dispute notice to ISK and say, okay, now on the silver platter, consider this request. And they have to deliver a response to that notice within 30 days. My goodness. And then within 20 days, you appoint an adjudicator. That adjudicator is appointed by Canada. And by the way, the only thing AFN did on this process is just say, well, that person, that adjudicator should be First Nations, and they should have child welfare experience. But they didn't even look at the fact that, look at the whole dispute process. Why is it all tailored to Canada? Why are we always jumping through the hoops? They just said, First Nation person, you know, they didn't do anything on this. All their proposed amendments are on very superficial, surface level stuff. And then when you go to the next slide, when there is this dispute resolution tribunal, that adjudicator has to then complete a review of Canada's decision or indecision, right? But they have to make a decision on the silver platter, and they finally get a decision. And they can only consider the materials that were before Canada's decision maker. So they're only looking at what Canada has to say. Then it says, oh, but they may consider the views of, you know, the nation or the agency, the legal traditions and protocols of the nation, the circumstances of the nation, the urgency of the funding, right? So here, Canada's stuff is all prioritized. You only can consider Canada's materials. Then it says, you may, okay, if you want to, you can take a look at First Nations legal orders and the urgency and, you know, all those important things, right? There is no requirement to make all those things that are the crux, the whole issue of your request, right? There's no obligation. It's may. It's at your discretion. But, Canada stuff, you got to. Tailored to Canada. The whole focus is on Canada in this thing, and it's crazy to me. So if we can just go on. Now, just quickly, the stuff on substantive equality, right? Again, we thought the issues before the tribunal are ensuring First Nations children are treated fairly in CFS, and that, you know, what First Nations are receiving is substantively equal to what all other children in Canada have. That's the focus of the hearings. Never, in my wildest dreams, did I ever thought it would be a matter of ensuring First Nations kids in Manitoba, in BC, in Alberta, Saskatchewan, the Yukon, you know, would be substantively equal to Ontario's First Nation kids. And this is a huge issue because Ontario's now coming out with all these statements, and they're pretty ticked, you know? And this agreement, you know, completely favors them. And these are the reasons. There's two big examples that I can see that just kind of jumped out of the pages at me. The Reform Implementation Committee. So this is a committee that provides oversight and monitoring for how this whole reformed CFS program is going to be implemented, and it makes recommendations to Canada. So this committee, it was originally going to be 6 members out of 12 total were going to be from Ontario. So over half were going to be from Ontario. And that's, you know, when you look at it, when it's like, okay, substantive equality for all First Nations, why did Ontario get those seats? It was because you have the Chiefs of Ontario and the Anishinaabe Nation who are parties to this. But the reason they were parties was because they have a 1960, they were just funded differently, right? So yes, when it comes to process, there's certain things where they get that recognition because they've moved the matter along. But when it comes to the stuff that we're here to fix, the gravy, right? It's like, it's got to be equal for everybody. There's no way, in good faith, as a negotiator, would I sit there and say, okay, I'm going to, you know, substantive equality, that for First Nations, it means Ontario gets more. What are we saying, you know, to the tribunal and to the world where we say, okay, we're bringing this case for substantive equality, but, just for some people, just for some in our nations, not others. And I, no disrespect, but the leaders at the table, and I don't think, you know, reflect the general sentiments of those in Ontario doing this work, because we have people sitting at the table with us from Ontario that are saying, we don't think that's fair. And so, you know, political leaders, they have their own purposes for doing things, but this was a huge issue. And in Manitoba, that was raised in in August, before it went to vote in October. Now, AFN said, okay, we heard loudly and clearly the issues from everybody, and we came up with these proposed amendments. So AFN's proposed amendments include a seat for each region, but it still does not address the issue of it being heavily skewed to Ontario, because those two parties still maintain their seats, right? So it's still, you know, this skewed process. Now, this is a big one. The next one that skews the agreement in favor of Ontario is on First Nations representative services. Now, it did originate in Ontario, and it's a good thing, right? They have their own history, they have their own experience. But when you look to now, there's been a change where In my view, this is now across the nation since C-92, since that federal legislation. So funding for Ontario for First Nations representative services. So what this is in Ontario, it was okay, they don't have jurisdiction off reserve for their agencies, they have agencies on reserve. For those cases that are, say, Toronto, Sudbury, everywhere, nations have the ability, they have funding to make sure that the views and preferences and perspectives of First Nations are being considered in those legal matters involving their kids, right? So they had certain funding that was provided to them over time, enabling them to do that, for nations to show up and have a seat at the table in decisions affecting their kids. Now, what C-92 did when it was passed in 2020 is it made, nation representation. So we now have Section 13 of C-92 that says, okay, across the country, it's now a national standard that is part of substantive equality. Nations have a right to make representations in those legal proceedings involving their kids. That's a right that all First Nations across Canada have under Section 13 of that federal act. So that's everywhere now, and that was as of 2020. But what we have in this agreement in 2024 is still a provision that deals with First Nation representative services, where funding for Ontario is $924.2 million, while funding for the rest of First Nations across Canada, many of whom haven't had First Nation representative services, so they're having to build capacity. So for everybody else, it's $1.397 billion. So that means that the Ontario region alone receives 39.8% of the funding for First Nations representative services over the lifespan of that 10-year proposed agreement. So almost 40%, that's huge. When you see those numbers, right? $924 million to Ontario and $1.3 billion for everybody else, right? For the rest of Canada. And bear in mind, Ontario has had First Nation representative services. Has it worked perfectly? Absolutely not. But there's been some capacity there. Arguably, those across Canada that haven't had it would need more capacity, right? And when AFN, when this was raised to them, AFN's lawyer told us in Manitoba here in August that this was because Ontario's First Nations band representative services are legislated in provincial legislation in their CFS Act. But those explanations don't fly. And it's for that reason when we say the national standards, again, Section 13 now makes it a requirement as of 2020 that nations have to be given notice and they have a right to make representations in proceedings involving their kids. So nations can go to court. And we've represented agencies, our agency clients that we represent, we've given nations notice in a guardianship trial, for instance. And we called the nation, we gave them a big overview. The counselor from that nation came to court and again, briefed the nation and everything. Same canoe, the nation and the agency, right? And after that case, there was all this stuff that needed to be done. It was a matter of saying, okay, we're not going to support the guardianship to this non-Indigenous family because we have this aunt that we're going to monitor, right? The agency has, the obligation and has funding to do certain things, but the nation, where the nation's saying, well, we want to do some things. We want to bring the aunt, the foster parents, the child, we want to bring them to the nation. We want to have a reunification feast. We want, as the nation, to do our own planning on this and be a part of it. So the agency coordinated a lot of different things on that, but then again, the layer of complication came when it's like, okay, this child was placed off reserve. So the agency doesn't have very much funds for prevention off reserve. Those are almost always gone. The nation and the agency who have dollars for First Nations kids that are apprehended on reserve, right, those are for certain purposes. When it comes to a child who's placed off reserve, when the nation now, in making representations, wants to do all this wonderful stuff that's for the well-being of this child, right, that nation didn't have prevention dollars available, so they used band representation dollars. They used these First Nation representative, dollars in a creative way to do all those things the nation wanted to do in its own way. And yes, it collaborated with the agency, to get some dollars there, right? Another client we represent, nations from Manitoba in Alberta, where the Ministry of Alberta, very difficult to work with, they weren't looking at family. They weren't looking at family. They weren't even considering supporting visits from Alberta to Manitoba. So the nation rose up and said, we're going to use our band representation dollars. Here's Cookham over here. We're going to make sure that she can go to Alberta, meet everybody, do all the things we need to do. And when you're doing that, you can't just, one visit, one and done. That's a process and it takes time. So it took a number of trips to, Edmonton, and they did it. Those children successfully came back to the nation because of those efforts. And Ministry of Alberta was like, fine, come and make your representations. You do it. We don't believe in C92. In the Quebec reference on C92, Alberta was against this whole legislation. So they're against the law and they're against the services that are critical to our kids. So in that case, the nation, our nation client, used band representation dollars to do all those critical things they wanted to do. So when we see that this pot that is so needed, and yes, you're showing up in court, but it's all the things to support that behind it, right? So Ontario, with respect, we all have those same issues. And by the way, in Manitoba took those national standards, Section 13, and we absorbed those into the Provincial CFS Act. So those provisions on nations showing up in court and making representations, those are now at Section 2.9 sub 2 of Manitoba's CFS Act. So when AFN's lawyer came to Manitoba and said, the reason why Ontario's getting all this money is because it's in their provincial law. It's in ours too. It's in ours too, right? So this, and they still haven't dealt with this. So there is no basis in law for Ontario to receive more. And with respect, we have to be able to disagree respectfully. But what we can't do is show up and say, hey, this tribunal case that's supposed to end discrimination. But then you have Ontario that's seeking to do it and go ahead with an agreement that's going to discriminate against our own First Nation kids everywhere else in Canada. That's not what we mean by substantive equality. We're not going to leave anybody behind. So now the solutions, and just briefly, because I know we got to wrap up at some point and we could go on, but the Caring Society has, this wasn't just like, okay, complaining about all the issues. The solutions and the ideas, the thoughts, the Caring Society released our position on long-term reform in March? Earlier, March of 2024, right? Before they even got to the table, the Caring Society's like, hey, here's all this stuff we've learned from all these years from doing this, all this time, right? The purpose, principles, definition, structure, enforcement. The Caring Society says that's going to result in adequate funding to support good practice. And there's all these good, wonderful things. You even look at the principles. When the Caring Society first went to the table, it was saying, okay, when we're doing these big-scale negotiations, we need to be guided by principles and a protocol. And on those, we said, okay, it needs to be certain things, right? That was rejected. Canada, AFN, CU, and NAN said, we don't need principles. We don't need a protocol. We're just going to do our thing, right? And we see what happens when they do their thing. All this crazy, all these provisions that I scratch my head at, right? If you had, the key to principled negotiations is you actually have that protocol to guide, right? And simple things that apply to all of us across the board. Yes, there's unique circumstances, but there's certain principles that can be expressed in a negotiation protocol to ensure we're guided by those to meet those legal requirements. And it's simple things: respect for First Nations rights, respect for children's rights, substantive equality, actually ending discrimination, not best efforts and not, intentions and all this. That's all great, but that's what got you in trouble. You actually were ordered by law, by the federal court, end it and don't do it again. All these things, so principles, right? The next big one, funding allocation. Get rid of that nation agency divide in the funding allocation. Fund both that enable a needs-based approach that is informed by data and outcomes. We can do it. IFSD already created kind of the model to assist in all this, and we just have to think critically about how we're going to bring nations and agencies together and not divide and conquer. We can't make this subject to yearly parliamentary appropriation, as Stephanie said, right? That whole agreement and everything under it, the only thing when I read it at Section 5, it says there's $24.477 billion for the first 5 years, but that's subject to parliamentary appropriation. Nobody's ever been able to explain to me, who's supporting this agreement, where the $47.8 billion actually comes from. I can only see in the agreement that it's $24.47 billion for the first 5 years, but that's subject to parliamentary appropriation each year, meaning Parliament can say there's other pressing objectives, there's other health issues, there's tariffs coming in from Donald Trump, you know? Who knows, right? There's all this stuff. We might be the 51st state. There's all this stuff happening. So actually, this agreement that you all did, oops, we're going to go in there and reach parliamentary appropriation, and we're going to do what we want to do. And that's what the agreement says. So, you know, all I saw in there was this minimal commitment, and not even because it's subject to each year review. What the IFSD says is ring fender funding. And that's a finance term by very fancy people, but it's basically put restrictions on it so that it can only be used for a particular purpose, and that protects the funding from, you know, politicization, I can't say that very well, from politics, right? And ongoing discrimination. And there's a precedent. They did it for COVID-19. After COVID-19, Canada said, you know what, there's some pretty pressing things we need to do. We got to do some health research. We got to do all this stuff. So they ring-fenced funding for health research after COVID-19, which says we can't touch it. None of this yearly parliamentary appropriation. So they have ring-fenced funding. So when you have the IFSD, these experts in public finance and people that, wow, they just amaze me how like crazy smart these people are. They looked at First Nations child welfare funding and they said, ring-fence it to make it so that it's not subject to Canada's ongoing discrimination, which is now a legal precedent before the tribunal upheld by the federal court. The experts have said ring-fence it. In Canada, nothing, right? The Caring Society's position as well is that there's a non-reallocation clause that's needed, because all too often for First Nations, we know in budgets that they're going to take, if they're on the face of it looking to give over here, they're going to take from here. Even the housing stuff gets shifty and funny. What a big one is for me is on Jordan's principle. We see in here there's going to be a household calculation for needs. You look in this agreement that the funding they're providing on that needs stuff, the household allocation, then you look at Jordan's principle funding back to basics and the needs and stuff. What we're going to start seeing is if Canada got this agreement approved, they'd say, oh, hey, we got that in long-term reform. So when it comes to this piece, we don't need to do all that stuff. They're going to take and, you know, words are an art form, right? So the words they're using, we know already in this agreement, they're intending to say, okay, we put it in there, even though it's subject to yearly appropriation. So they're going to reallocate from your other budgets and do other things. So without a clause that says there's no reallocation, they can reallocate and do things. And it's not just, hey, the Caring Society saying that would be great, or First Nations saying, hey, after years and years of budgets and, you know, cutting and, you know, establishing programs and then having to, you know, dismantle them because reallocation and funding cuts, right? The tribunal has said it. The tribunal made an order in 2018 CHRT 4, and the Caring Society has this on their positions, CHRT 4 at paragraph 422. Canada must not reallocate funds from other social programs, especially housing, to fund its obligation under the CHRT orders and related agreements. So it's already what we have right now under the orders, where the tribunal is saying you can't be reallocating. So if that's already an order now, you would think that we would have seen it in that agreement. If Canada, AFN, Coup and Nan were doing their job, we would have seen what the tribunal ordered in law in that agreement, and it's not there. That's a huge issue. The Caring Society's position on reformed funding not being time limited, so a 10-year agreement. We need to make sure that this isn't just, you know, political decision makers, right? This whole reformed approach has to be a minimum standard for Canada and funding CFS. The Caring Society has also said funding legislation. Canada must table and support funding legislation to create effective statutory funding regimes that will embed the whole funding purpose, principle, structure, everything in those levels as minimums, right? And we see it, and there's been some research done by the Caring Society, that farmers have legislation. When farmers face a hard time, right, with weather and all this, there's a whole legislative regime there to protect farmers, to make sure that Canada can kick in and help them, right? Because they recognize the significance of farmers and the way they contribute to the economy, even though things are changing, right? We see legislation. When Canada views things as a priority, there's legislation. So farmers have legislation. Why can't First Nations kids who've been, you know, harms of the worst kind and discriminated, why can't there be legislation for kids? There's a whole bunch of other stuff in terms of what we need to do, right? How the funding needs to be due, not subject to downward adjustments, right? Evidence-based approaches that we have to, gather, collect evidence to support our positions and make sure that we're analyzing the patterns so we're not doing, more of the same. And then on dispute resolution, just simple. Right now, there is no mechanism. When we as a legal team were reviewing this, I had my young law students, and she's a young lawyer from OCN. She was reading out to our group, here's what dispute resolution tribunal can't do. And it said, make orders of systemic change to remedy discrimination. And a lawyer, non-Indigenous, she laughed. She burst out laughing. She's like, well, she doesn't know the case, right? She doesn't, she didn't go through it the way all of us did, right? But she's like, just your average kind of lawyer, grew up in Canada, grew up in Manitoba. She's listening to this and she's like, wasn't that what this whole case was about, right? And now the tribunal, the dispute resolution tribunal that's being set up under the agreement can't make orders that result in systemic change. Like, it was laughable. It was absolutely laughable. So all of this stuff, we need to make sure that the dispute resolution tribunal can make systemic orders to stop discrimination, prevent its recurrence, the power to grant injunctive relief, which means, hey, you got to stop this. There's a legal order that's going to say, Canada, stop. If you're reallocating stuff, if you're, making, you're being unreasonable in your decisions, stop. Compensate victims and make sure that we're really addressing Canada's willful and reckless discrimination and order costs against them when they're not. So none of that, of course, was in there because Canada already doesn't comply with tribunal orders, right? So I'll wrap it up. As I've been told, I have like 5 minutes, right? Now it's probably down to like 2. But when this, agreement came out, like let's just look at our journey, right? In this tribunal since 2007, once the merit decision came in 2016, there's been like 30 non-compliance orders where Canada hasn't complied. And so the huge issue is, why did we expect that the first draft of this agreement to remedy the whole thing, we should have been able to expect that they would do it. But we know from their behavior and all their non-compliance that they weren't going to do what was right in the first instance. They're not going to do what's fair and just in the first instance, that it's always a matter of they have to be taken to the tribunal in order to do what's finally right. So this is a first draft, and it's troubling that Ontario, we just received word, is going ahead on the first draft. Ontario wants that first draft for their kids and families. So some of the things they're going to be stuck with, right? Some of the things they're going to be stuck with, and to them that's fine, and respectfully, that's their decision that they made on an informed and free and consensual basis among their people. But it was a first draft, and we can't expect that Canada is going to negotiate in good faith when we've seen all throughout their history just completely not the case. So I thank you for your time, and we can offer the slides. I'll take out some of my more colorful commentary, but we've got like the sections, right, where it has the actual sections of the agreement. Like when people are coming in support of this, like refer to those sections and ask them, and it's okay. We have to have respectful dialogue. Respectfully, if you're supporting this agreement, can I just ask you, what do you think about these? How do you think that's going to work on the ground? When you go and vote or when you go and push for this, and then your nation is on the ground having to deal with, children and families, what are you going to do? What's your plan? So it's okay to do that. We have to do that. That's free, prior, and informed consent, and that's just doing it right for kids, right? My goodness. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a good rest of the day, and enjoy the gala. Ekase. Spirit bear. I don't know, Jen, I don't know.
With our time left, Ray, are you still going to say a few words? I've already got some emails about, will you get the slides? And the answer to that is yes. So if you were wondering that, I can answer that. But do you have any questions for our speakers, folks?
Um, my name is John Henry. I'm a counselor for Norway House Cree Nation. My portfolio CFS under CP Municipal Agency. In our community, housing is very, you know, I'll give you an example. This summer, I had 14 grandchildren living in my 5-bedroom house. And, yeah, and I'm very proud, you know, to say that, you know, I would step up and have none of my grandchildren in care. I think it's all up to our families to make sure we keep our children out of the system. But one of the things that I see, and I heard it discriminatory, all our communities are set up for failure. And I mean by failure is that Norway House Cree Nation receives 12 houses, funded houses, stick-built per year. And the waiting list is 700 families. You know, can you imagine that? I know because my portfolio is housing, and I deal with a lot of conflicts within, because sometimes there's 18, 19 people living in a three-bedroom house. It's very hard, and that's where a lot of kids come into care because of the overcrowding. And we see that. And at the same time, our community, we have a mine coming up. It's supposed to be nickel, but it's not. We're going to be mining the quarry limestone and the magnesium inside there. So we're not going to mine the nickel, so the environmental issue is not going to be there for the water. It's going to be worth billions. We have a partnership coming up from Japan, I believe. So we're working on stuff, you know, to alleviate our housing. We're not going to depend on the government. You know, we need to step up as leaders and try and find ways to alleviate the crisis, the housing crisis in our community. And the other thing too, that since I got in, we evicted 22 people from their homes, and that's drug dealers. We BCR'd a few since we got in 2022, and it's that I have a team. There's 3 of them: Trudy, Hart, Todd York, and Susan Mino. They're called bylaw housing officers. These are the first 3 people. Our CMP is not going to do anything. You know, because I have the portfolio, I entered homes with these 3 people. Our CMP are waiting way in the back. They're not going to come with us to shut down a home. One raid, we confiscated over $50,000 drug money and drugs. One night I went home. My wife said, "Why do you smell like that?" Because we handled drugs, and I guess that was meth on my clothes. And it's a scary feeling. You don't know, because we had times that the people pulled knives, guns. Like I said, I have 30 grandchildren, 4 great-grandsons, another one coming on the way this summer. I was elected to protect our community. You know, I worked for CFS for 7 years, but KSMA. I was a school social worker for 23 plus years for Frontier. And I coached, you know, Little League Baseball, minor hockey, you name it. I've done everything, after school activities. But the main thing that I see is the government, like, discriminatory, what they were saying here, but we're set up for failure. Every First Nations, I guarantee you that funding for drugs, for support, treatment center, and all that. That's where it's stemming from. You know, in a few years, I hope to see we don't have CFS agencies. You know, that's my goal in our community. And that means we did our job, you know, that the grandparents are rising up, the children are rising up, taking care of their own kids, you know, and, but it's hard when there's drugs in the community. And, but like I said, we're going to be on our path for economic. With the mine, like I said, it's going to be worth billions on number 6 here, past Grand Rapids. And we bought a hotel, your mainstay here, and that's going to be generating $4 or $5 million a year. And we bought 820 Taylor, that old hydro building, and again, that's we're going to be revenues will be a lot, and we're going to have a business sector in our community. Food, 5 or 6 food courts, and you know, it's just economic, like to help our, you know, get housing, generate funds, you know, treatment, and we have a treatment center in our background. We have a mouse and leg laws. We're going to use that for land base. So there are a lot of activities that we're planning. We you know, but the funds, we're not going to depend on the government anymore. Like I said, my hope is to not see a CFS agency in our office in 10 years, maybe. But that, you know, that means that well, the community is doing their job. The parents are keeping the kids. Nobody will come into care anymore. And, you know, for me, and that's my goal. I hope for all communities, but I have cousins down here, at Roseau. I have Garden Hill, Oxford House. It's the same story. Like 10 houses per year, and the waiting list is 300, 400, 500, 600 people waiting to get a house. Meanwhile, we have people living, 18, 19 people in the home, and that's where the problems are, you know, from the overcrowding, sorry. But we're still gonna fight. People have in our community. I get a lot of support. Like this morning, must have got about 300 inboxes, texts. There's drug dealers here, there. You know, can you come and shut the home down? And that's what we're doing in our community. And I'm hoping that Cross Lake can do that. You know, our neighbors. Check stop, and we got the cows and plows coming. It's going to be another story, but we'll be ready for that. But that's what we're doing, and hopefully we need that self-autonomy. You know, the ability to govern ourselves, and to have the funds to, you know, to help our community. But I really like listening to the people, the presentations here. It's really, like I said, my heart is in CFS. I worked for 7, 8 years, and you know, just keeping the children safe. And that's it. Like I said, thank you.
Thank you. And I think as you were talking, I was thinking about Stephanie's slide where she said to go. Okay.
I have one quick question for Stephanie over there. Can you give us a sense of, since this is a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling, and they're going to review any settlement agreement. So when the chiefs rejected, like the majority of the chiefs of the Assembly of First Nations rejected that, it was the second draft, right? The second draft settlement. When they rejected that in October, they weren't talking about money so much as all the lack of addressing the discrimination. And that was the big point. There's no plan here on how to end discrimination against our children. So what I was wondering is if, well, Canada's going to go ahead and sit down with the Chiefs of Ontario and with NAN, who are also parties to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case. So there are two of the parties that are there, although NAN is part of the Chiefs of Ontario. They're listed, the two of them together, you know, under their both names. Then it's the Assembly of First Nations as well, and the Caring Society. So if Canada goes to negotiate a settlement, I'm assuming that it's going to have to go in front of the tribunal for approval. And essentially, we're just going to wait for that process to come forward. Is that right? You're nodding your head. Okay. All right. That's what I wanted to get a sense of the time frame.
I can answer some of that as well. So yes, it does have to go, the Ontario agreement does have to go to the tribunal for their approval. So, you know, the tribunal has a very high standard for what it means to end discrimination in child and family services. So it still has to pass their test. And so I'm kind of unclear about the timelines right now. Obviously, Ontario is trying to get this done as soon as possible. They want to take advantage of the current government that's in place. So I think we could expect to see this going before the tribunal in like early to mid-February. And then it'll be discussed at the tribunal. And so right now, we don't know what's in that Ontario-specific agreement, so we're very eager to see what's in there. And then once we see what's actually in that agreement, Caring Society will assess what kind of submissions we also want to make at the tribunal, because as you mentioned, we are parties and we do have standing. So it's a process that should start to roll out very quite soon. Excellent question. And other parties can intervene as well as First Nations in Ontario, because not all First Nations in Ontario are represented by COO and NAN. And obviously they were not part of the negotiation process. So those First Nations can make representation. They can apply for interested party status at the tribunal, as well as any other First Nation or organization that wants to make standing at the tribunal. They can apply for that as well.
Anyone else?
Well, thank you so much for joining us, guys, and thanks for staying to the end. Great questions, great discussion, and thank you, and look forward to seeing you guys later.